going on, guys? So I think every YouTube channel kind of gets to this point where you end up with all these little videos that you're not really sure what to do with. They're not quite long enough to fit into an episode, and they just get thrown into a folder called unfinished, never to see the light of day. But I think there's some interesting stuff in there, and I'd like to share it with you guys, so we're going to get into that. Right now I think we're going to call this episode the chip tray, because you know, it's one of those things you should clean out more often than you probably do, and when you get around to it, it feels pretty good. So let's get into it.
All right, first project is just going to be some T-nuts for the mill. I think it came with 4, but we needed some more for some other stuff, and Ryan figured it would be a good first project. Real simple. He just milled some slots down the sides of some steel. You can see here he's doing a little bit of face milling. Pretty simple process all around. Ryan's using an edge finder here to get his center line. I think this was just a bit of an excuse to practice, but you can also see Ryan's got a little bit of a stop set up. That kind of leads us into our next project you'll see after this one, but just drilling holes. Those are going to be tapped. I don't remember what size they are. I'll have to link that in the description maybe. Pretty standard for T-nuts though. I will say these are to a much tighter tolerance than most T-nuts you'll buy. I think most are just cast. These fit really nice and snug. I'll let Ryan talk about these.
All right, well, after a quick rinse, here's my nuts. I think they came out all right.
All right, that leads us into this next project. This is going to be a stop for the mill. You saw Ryan had just clamped some scrap metal into the vise for the last stop, and I think this inspired him to build a new tool, so that's the next project. Again, we started this, this was probably the first week we had the mill, so we were just looking for excuses for stuff that we could use it with. I'm not sure if this shape is gonna make sense to most people, but you'll see at the end of this little segment what it looks like. It's a simple device, but it is pretty handy. Ryan's spot drilling all his holes here. Again, probably not necessary for the level of precision we're going for, but might as well get some good practice in. You can see Ryan's gauge blocks on the side angle gauge blocks. He wanted that sucker at exactly 45 degrees. More spot drilling, more tapping, kind of business as usual around the shop. Alright, you can see how it works here. It's a pretty simple device, but it's handy. One thing we didn't show was how we cut that slit. I believe Ryan just used the bandsaw on that, but that brings us to the next project. Alright, you guessed it. Next up is the slitting saw. I know it probably seems like we're doing things in reverse order here, but it's one of those situations where you don't know you need a tool until you need the tool. So instead of just going out and buying them, we tend to make them around here. This one is pretty simple. It's just a 3/4 inch arbor we cut on the lathe. That's the biggest size we can fit in the R8 collets that the mini mill takes. We got a countersunk screw here and a retaining cap here. This has got a little bit of relief cut to make room for the extra thickness of the actual arbor that holds the blade on. This allows you to put different thicknesses of blades on there. I think that's how most slitting saws are made. I'm not totally sure. I looked at a few pictures online before I made this one, and that's kind of how it was done. You can pick slitting saws up on Amazon or eBay pretty cheap. This one is pretty good. It seemed to work fine. I've only used it a handful of times so far. I will say that the bore in this is not quite round. It's probably oblong by about 1 thou or 2 thou, which restricted just how close of a tolerance I could get this arbor. I probably cut a little too much off this material if I'm being honest, but it still works fine. So, yep, simple project. What's next? All right, the next part we have, unfortunately I don't have much video of Ryan making it, but it's gonna be a new handle for the vise. So this is gonna be a 3-sided handle. Ryan demonstrating the proper way to find the center on a curve. You guys commented on the last video, you're absolutely right. That center part where you see welded, that's actually just a driver from a ratchet set. We bought an extra cheap set just for this purpose. Okay, the next project is going to be a compound slide delete on the lathe. This is a pretty simple project too, but it's something I've been meaning to do for a while. The compound on our lathe is not great. It's a little underbuilt in my opinion, and it is pretty worn out as well. Until we have a surface grinder to clean up the ways, this is going to help produce a lot cleaner parts on the lathe. The compound slide's usually used for tapers or for thread milling, which we do some of, but not a lot. So when we're not doing those sorts of things, it's better to take off the compound slide altogether and just use the 2 axes. It's a much more rigid system when you take that off. So that's what I'm working on here. It's just a big hunk of steel with some holes drilled in it. You can see I'm using a counter bore. I got a counter bore set on Amazon. I think they're the AccuSize brand, and they work real well. Here you can see I'm using those T-nuts we built earlier to bolt this straight to the table. It was a little too tall with the drill bit in the mill to get to that center, so that worked pretty well. Here I'm disassembling the cross slide on the lathe. We're gonna have to drill some new holes in that and put some threads in it. I would feel bad about drilling holes in the nice cross slide, but as you can see, this thing has quite a few already. Here you can see one of the more worn out parts of the lathe. This Acme thread has really been worn out in the center. Would love to replace it. If you guys have any links for some parts, let me know. Just taking out the gibs here so that they don't get in the way while I'm drilling holes. Wouldn't quite fit in my vise without pulling the vise jaws out. It's pretty neat drilling into cast steel. It definitely makes a different kind of chip. You can see the hole pattern lines up pretty nice. I'm finally getting used to adjusting for the backlash on our mill. I think the next thing I'm going to get though is a DRO, just so I don't have to think about it. Alright, let's put the whole thing back together. The gibs need a bit of adjusting, but I'll get around to that once everything's nice and square. I went ahead and made this a reference surface just in case we ever needed it, so it's nice and square to the movement. And we have a brand new quick release. I think we got this from Shars, and it seems pretty good. It's on the bigger end for this size lathe, which is how I like it. I'm cutting some steel for the first time with this setup, and it does a much nicer job. There's almost no flex. There's not much of a taper cut into it. Works really well. But that's gonna do it for this episode. Hope you guys enjoyed this kind of random collection of stuff. I'll leave you with a little garage cleanup. This is something everybody has to do from time to time, and we took the opportunity to rearrange the furniture, so to speak. I think it turned out pretty well. Unfortunately, I lost the video of me struggling to move the lathe by myself, but just trust me, it went fine. And I know I'm gonna get a lot of comments about this frame I'm moving around. We'll get around to that in another episode, 2019, 2020, somewhere around there. And as long as I was cleaning up the shop, might as well clean up the studio as well. My girlfriend gave me a hand with this, much appreciated. Monkey, of course, being our diligent supervisor, made sure we kept working. But that's gonna do it, guys. See you on the next one.